Russia is not going to supply Iran with the surveillance tech to be able to target Mossad agents when, for 10 years inside Syria, Russia was standing down when Israel was assassinating Iranian targets.
You know, there is an incredible disconnect between what's actually happening and what seems to be the expert opinion in the West. And, you know, we've probably all covered this for the longest of times to, you know, what I would just simply say is it seems like they're simply experts on what the State Department says about Iran as opposed to what's actually going on in Iran or Lebanon or Syria or anywhere else. So
Russia has delivered one tanker of oil to Cuba. Everyone now is kind of saying, look, Russia broke the blockade. Russia can't break a U.S. blockade.
So I say it like miss the forest for the trees. I see this in every agenda we're dealing with where we have a crime that takes place. Let's just take the obvious illegal nature of this war. And instead of going right there, boom, even, you know, including all the other presidents before them, Biden included, that's a crime. We should arrest them for that. Instead, it becomes this, and we should look at this too, but not miss the point, becomes this grandiose conversation about some deeper conspiracy about how they may work together. And we miss the crime that's taking place, the genocide they're committing.
We're all painted as these Islamist kind of people incapable of understanding Christian liberationism as perceived by the West. And I can assure you, I'm a Christian, very much so. And I would say the West is completely devoid of anything related to Christian liberation. Christian liberation has been founded in the concept of armed resistance for the liberation of human dignity. They never expected the Palestinian resistance, particularly in Gaza, to become a military group capable of standing in the face of genocide. And still, until today, no international force, not one, is willing to step 1 foot on Gazan soil.
What makes us think that we are in a position to judge the system of the people who resist against that?
Supremacy.
All right. Good day, everyone. We are here with another show. A very interesting panel I have now with Ryan, Christian, Vanessa, Beeley, and Myriam. I don't know your last name right now, Myriam. I'm sorry about that, but you can say it yourself later on if needed. Lots of very cool people. I'm going to let you first tell us all who you are. And then I'll introduce you a bit to the theme of today's talk. So I would like to start with you, Myriam.
So good day. My family name actually is Charabaty. So my name is Myriam Charabaty. It's a pleasure to meet everyone, and thank you for having me. So I am Lebanese based in Beirut, currently just out of Beirut, actually. So I'm a journalist on the ground, and I have an affinity, let's call it that, to understanding the socio-historic aspects that led to where we are today, and answer largely influenced by the West, infiltrated by the West, to the extent that we reached a state of civil strife in the area of the Arab world and within the Islamic world, and to answer the questions of how other groups, other sects live within this community and these worlds. So I'm happy to be here today. Let's see where this goes.
Thank you. And Vanessa?
Well, basically, I'm an independent journalist that has spent really the last sort of 15, maybe more years in this region in West Asia, from Gaza to Egypt, Iraq, living in Syria for 5 years, working in Syria for 10 years, and then now since the fall of Syria, living in Beirut for the last year and a bit. For me, I think, and this is one reason that I think Myriam's input is going to be so important, is I want to address, I want to try to bridge the gap between the Western discourse on the incoming kind of technocratic surveillance tyranny and what's happening in this region, and how this region ties into that or doesn't tie into that, because my opinion is that it sometimes presented in too much of a reductionist way by largely, well, almost entirely Western commentators that perhaps don't have an understanding of this region entirely, other than the kind of colonialist perspective from both sides, but not the actual even religious perspective from the comparison between Sunni Islam, Shia Islam, how that also comes into this entire discussion about the incoming CBDC in the West, the COVID, all of this, because I think it's just too narrowly analyzed by many people that are looking at it very much from a perspective. And I talk about myself from this also. I'm not an economist. A lot of that kind of goes over my head. But at the same time, there is an element of dehumanization of this region in that analysis, which becomes extremely highbrow, very economics focused, and not focused on that very deep perspective that I think Myriam can bring a lot of illumination to in this region.
Well said, well said. And finally, Ryan?
Thanks again for putting this on. And well, my name is Ryan Christian, the Last American Vagabond. Simply put, I would say that I'm an aggregator of the excellent work put out by people like Vanessa and Myriam and other independent journalists out there on the ground actually doing the real work and just trying to give people an insight into all the chaos out there. You know, and so I really enjoyed the last conversation we had about this, and I'm looking forward to having this today, in particular with what Vanessa said and having Myriam here. You know, there is an incredible disconnect between what's actually happening and what seems to be the expert opinion in the West. And, you know, we've all probably all covered this for the longest of times to, you know, what I would just simply say is it seems like they're simply experts on what the State Department says about Iran as opposed to what's actually going on in Iran or Lebanon or Syria or anywhere else. So thanks for having us today.
All right, that was great. Thank you all for being here. And I think I can immediately jump on what Vanessa just said, and you as well, Ryan, about the whole conversation in the West. And that is, I recently saw, and I don't know if you've seen it, Vanessa. I think I shared it with you. I recently saw this one of the typical usual suspects in the Western so-called anti-imperialist scene. And that was, what's his name? McGregor, I think Colonel McGregor. And he said and if Israel's going to use nukes, then Russia's going to use nukes on Israel. And I was like, this is so disconnected, you know, and people are hundreds of thousands of views and people are listening to these guys. And I'm like, okay, we gotta talk about this stuff because this is not good. And the reason why we actually started this show, or why we wanted to do this show, started actually with a discussion I had with Vanessa on a guy called Simon Dixon, who sees behind this what's happening in West Asia as a very grand strategy almost of global elites trying to instigate a kind of a new world order, a global reset. Everything is being controlled, you could say. Then also recently I saw a video by Richard Medhurst, who also talks about a grand strategy behind this all, but a bit more localized to the United States empire. He said that it's what's happening right now is destroying all gas and energy competition to make America the hegemonic LNG exporter. Now, funnily, we just had Jeffrey Sachs come over to our university, so I had a dialogue with him, and Peter and myself had a dialogue with him. And he also thinks it's a grand strategy, but he says it's an irrational one. He thinks it's just stupidity of the West. We also talked to Michael Hudson, Professor Michael Hudson, just now, who also thinks it's a grand strategy to destroy China. Okay, so it's so many different grand strategies, and what you actually see in all these discussions is that in the mainly Western discussions, I must say, that everybody believes in this grand puppet master imperialist strategy behind everything that is going on. And I just recently saw a very interesting interview with a couple of comrades on another channel who said that this is a form of Western supremacy and white supremacy. The idea that they are like these grand, right, Myriam? These grand imperialists are controlling what is happening, and it completely strips the region of any impact or agency to change the course of history. I mean,
Mm.
what about what's happening in Lebanon? What about the Palestinian resistance? What about Yemen, Iran, you name it? As if these are all players in this grand strategy, this grand chessboard, you could say. Now, Ryan often focuses on the very, you could say, the macro aspect. Myriam and Vanessa, you are more on the ground in Lebanon. So maybe I can start with you, Vanessa, because we had that discussion. What do you want to say about this? Because I think you are itching to say something about this.
Well, first of all, let's just cancel the whole narrative that Russia's going to actually, physically intervene in this war. It's already been proven. It's even been denied by Dmitry Peskov and by Lavrov that they're providing any surveillance technology or any drone technology. In fact, it's the opposite. Iran has for some time been supplying Russia with advanced drone technology, far more advanced than what Russia previously had been producing. Of course, Russia now has Iranian tech that it can reverse engineer and actually now further develop its own drone industry. So I think that's an important point to make because, social media is such it's such an unbelievable amplification of nonsense, actually. And what it's doing, it's dumbing people down to the point where they're not able to logically think through what they're seeing. And so they just regurgitate what is being given the greatest platform on any social media project, right? So if, for example, now Russia has delivered one tanker of oil to Cuba, everyone now is kind of saying, look, Russia broke the blockade. Russia can't break a US blockade around any Latin American country. This had to be done in agreement with the United States. And again, Dmitry Peskov has actually come out and said, we were talking about all this. We negotiated this through Kirill Dmitriev, Jared Kushner, and Stephen Witkoff, who are representatives of the Zionist complex, right? And this is what I'm saying. People jump onto something to confirm their own bias without rationally thinking through the background to whatever action that these countries are taking. Russia is not going to supply Iran with the surveillance tech to be able to target Mossad agents when for 10 years inside Syria, Russia was standing down when Israel was assassinating Iranian targets, including the Iranian embassy in Damascus, right? That logically doesn't make any sense. Also doesn't make any sense because Iran is using the Chinese Beidou military system that it transitioned to in 2025. The GLONASS system, the Russian system, doesn't work very well in that terrain or in that area, right? So what I'm trying to say is there's a lot of misinformation circulating. And that includes, I think, I have two major points, and Myriam knows what they are, that are undermining the agency of resistance in this region. One is the narrative that Hamas was entirely created and funded and supported by Israel. And the second one is that Ayatollah Khamenei is an asset of President Carter and French intelligence. Those two narratives, which are being very heavily pushed by certain media outlets in the West, originally from the West, some of them, although they may have relocated, are not looking deep enough, in my opinion, into the complexities around these resistance organizations, as in Hamas, and the length of their existence, right, which is what, now 100 years, more or less, right? And how during that journey to being the primary recognized Palestinian resistant faction in Gaza, there have been multiple splits and internal conflicts and changes within the organization, even up to 2017 onwards in their relation with Syria, for example. Myriam can give a lot more detail on that. And the same with Iran. You can't reduce a country of 93 million with a civilization 6,200 years old into, oh, this is another imperialist project from 1979 until now. They're part of an imperialist project. Again, this is why I wanted to bring Myriam in, because her understanding of the region, of the history, is a very important. And this is another thing. When I see these people talking, I would love to see them bring on people like Myriam or Marwa or regional experts or analysts to be able to actually, as I said, it's not about contradicting what someone is saying. It's about enriching the discussion so that there's a greater understanding of where we're heading and which elements are actually genuinely resisting what all of us fear, actually. We just might fear different aspects of it. But it's still effectively the same project being led by the same complex that is dominated by the Zionist oligarchical powers behind the governments, behind the thrones of power, particularly in the West, but also, I would say, in Russia, for example, and even China. There are elements within the Chinese oligarchical system, the fact that the elites send virtually all of their children to study in the West. So I think we need to, and actually, Karim, it would be great to get that exchange of discourse between people from China also and people from the West that maybe have a misunderstanding about what's actually happening in China and what China is trying to achieve, etc. This for me is so important, because without that, you're kind of operating in a very monochrome dynamic. You're not bringing in the color and the understanding and the perspectives that you need to fully understand, because it is so complex.
If I could
make
jump
sense?
in.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, I just to support everything Vanessa said, and, on misinformation in particular, what's going on the platforms, but to kind of bring those, like where you ended up there, Vanessa, and what you started with on this kind of grand perspective. It's interesting because there's multiple levels on it. If I could, to touch on the very important Hamas point that you made as well, it's the same kind of conversation, but let's recognize that, okay, so it's obvious that everyone can kind of sense a global or like a larger agenda, right? Like it seems the interesting part is whether it's China or everyone kind of says it's the global plan for this or that, and we all kind of disagree, but we all sense this kind of global thing. But here, what's interesting is as you also pointed out, that shouldn't be used or engaged with in a way to undermine like the agency or the individual actions, the strife of these local groups and what they're fighting for. Like there are elements of both, right? There is a clear, like even to the point of going back to like the COVID discussion and discussing whether there was an element of lockstep sort of agendas, even amongst adversarial nations. Like I think that was the case to a certain degree, but I also think that there's still adversarial nations very clearly and have very clear divides and different, agendas. And so one thing I want to point out is that I think we have to acknowledge, as Vanessa was touching on, the larger sort of technocratic agenda that seems to be at least trying to embed itself everywhere. At the same time, though, like we have to recognize that I think part of the trap today, like we're seeing a lot with this administration, is using, from the American perspective, things that we see and want to trick us into something else, is that it's clear that, that there is sort of like this game being played to make people look at that and to assume, right? So I say it like miss the forest for the trees. I see this in every agenda we're dealing with where we have a crime that takes place. Let's just take the obvious illegal nature of this war. And instead of going right there, boom, even, is including all the other presidents before them, Biden included, that's a crime. We should arrest them for that. Instead, it becomes this, and we should look at this too, but not miss the point. It becomes this grandiose conversation about some deeper conspiracy about how they may work together. And we miss the crime that's taking place, the genocide they're committing, and that I think is a ploy, right? Even though there is a grand discussion. So it has to be a mix of both. And I do think that's being abused by very clear players. And very quickly, the point about Hamas in the same conversation, right? Is as Vanessa and I have had many conversations about this, it's clear that there has been manipulation there, funding and efforts to try, and you could argue to levels of how much that influence existed over the years. And I would argue they did very much use that, as you can at least see from their statements of trying to use it to divide the situation. But that's very different than where we are today. And even if it is completely controlled, it doesn't invalidate the reality of the active armed resistance from an occupied territory. So it's about trying to muddy the waters with a broad picture to try to get people into an oversimplified view to whitewash their crimes, to make it very simple. But that just a large point, but we can get into all these different discussions. But I think that's really important to see how almost like parts of the truth are used to keep us from seeing the big picture.
Yeah.
Myriam?
I'm going to happily intervene. There is an American plot. They never expected Hezbollah in southern Lebanon to turn into a regional player. But it did. We saw it in Yemen, we saw it in Iraq, we saw it in Lebanon, we saw it in Syria, we saw it in Palestine, right? They never expected the Palestinian resistance, particularly in Gaza, to become a military group capable of standing in the face of genocide. And still, until today, no international force, not one, is willing to step 1 foot on Gazan soil. And that is not because they're too worried about their soldiers. That is because it's a waste of resources. They will never be able to stabilize any presence. And the Israelis have proven that. They cannot stabilize any presence. It's a constant loss and war and attrition. So when we talk about grandiose plans, oftentimes it's because our people don't have a say, and when they have a say, we're kind of painted as these aggressive, barbaric criminals that are not ready for democracy, and we deserve what's coming to us, and etc., etc. And very often we're all painted as these Islamist kind of people incapable of understanding Christian liberationism as perceived by the West. And I can assure you, I'm a Christian, very much so, and I would say the West is completely devoid of anything related to Christian liberation. Christian liberation has been founded in the concept of armed resistance for the liberation of human dignity, right? And we saw that in Latin America. We saw that in Ireland. We saw that really in more places than I can think of. What we did not see is that we did not see it in the Crusades. We did not see Christian liberation in the Crusades. We saw Christian greed and power in the Crusades. And I think this is the second aspect of what I wanted to talk about. The idea that at core, any change that happens in what is called the Middle East, in West Asia, it is founded in the idea of developing the world, right? But what it really is, it's about how the West thinks about dividing our resources without us getting much of it. So the less we get, the more they get. So that's the idea. So anything we do is always painted as either a failed attempt, or as a lost hope, or as a love for death, or a lack of love for life, a lack of love for peace. What it truly is, it's another hurdle in their plot for complete takeover of our resources, which they were not able to do. Even if they were able to do it to a large degree, they were not able to consolidate fully. And I don't know if I answered some of the questions that were put forward. And definitely Russia has never perceived itself as part of the conflict. At best, it has its own interests, and it would come in and out based on its own interest, with limitation as to what its interests are. And its interests fundamentally lie with the idea of the Arab world and the Islamic world not being liberated. Right. It lies with the idea of the Americans never fulfilling their hopes in the Middle East or in West Asia or in the Islamic world, but also not in the Arab world and the Islamic world reaching liberation. Their interest fundamentally is in our continuous struggle. Let's put it that way. So when we look at it from that perception, a rise of an Islamic world for which the Arab world would be part of is fundamentally problematic for Russia. They have the Chechenian problem, as they would call it, if that would happen. And it would affect their resources, because Israel also secures a lot of their resources. So they're also not interested in the elimination of Israel as an advanced Western proxy that also benefits Russia and China. So when we look at it from that perspective, we see a whole lot of difference. Now, if we talk, just to quickly go over the Russia-Iran idea, I think Russia would interfere in anything related to Iran in one case, if that interference meant absolute opportunism after the fact that the Americans have been defeated in the region, and they just jump in at the last minute in a highly opportunistic position to take what they can take in a new rising and changing world, right? And that's their interest. That's how they perceive it. And just to be clear, this is regardless of judgment to that. It's their interests, not mine. It's their politics, not mine. But I will not bow or wait or beg for any kind of support or help from anyone whose interest. So I guess that's that.
Yeah, if I can quickly jump in, and then I'll leave it to you, Vanessa, and Ryan. I saw Ryan also writing things down, so probably you have stuff in your mind. So I just wanted to jump into something that I've been thinking about today, and you touched on that as well, Myriam. And you said that resistance in West Asia has always been classified as being barbarous, and people here are just terrorists and savages, and etc., etc. And it reminds me of something we also see on the so-called good side in the West, anti-imperialists, leftists, you name it, who are always coming with these ridiculous disclaimers. So when they talk about Iran, they always start with that disclaimer. I'm not a fan of Iran, but I'm so sick of that stuff. I really can't handle it because, we also don't. Our societies are so problematic. You can just stop with these disclaimers, and it reminds me of a discussion that I saw between some people today, and they also said that you can see Iran, like for example, even leftists and imperialists will say that, for example, oh, you side with Iran? Yeah, well, America is worse. Okay, but and it was the guy called Indica, and he said, why don't we actually say, what if we see Iran actually as good? We're still not at the point to say, what if we actually think they're good? Like the Western left, the Western, you could say, the activists, etc. That is just simply a bridge too far. And he made such a good point. Like, how come we cannot actually say, maybe these people are actually good people who are actually doing something for this world, fighting against oppression, fighting against inequality, doing a moral battle for humanity. And I was like, that is just such a great claim, such an important point to make. And I always say, when I see, for example, somebody like what's this Greek professor's name, this economist, his name, the bald guy, his name just slips out. Yanis Varoufakis. Yanis
Yes.
Varoufakis. and sometimes I like listening to him. He sometimes has very good stuff, but then he comes, then these disclaimers come where what was it again? Oh yeah, a disclaimer about the regime in Iran or something, and then I think to myself, we Westerners, what gives us the moral high ground coming from the most violent, imperialist, genocidal cultures in human history? What makes us think that we are in a position to judge the system of the people who resist against that?
Supremacy.
I'm just baffled by that stuff.
Yes,
but I would say though, what's important though, and this is speaking entirely from my opinion perspective here, is that I don't think it behooves us to ever try to frame this as binary good bad. I just think that's not in our interest when it comes to government. Let's say,
No.
I personally think that government's bad. I just not even necessarily like evil or wrong. I do think that's where it leads to, but I think government. Let's put it this way: I don't believe in government and that it should exist. That's a different philosophical, ideological point. But I think that I want to make sure that's clear for why I'm about to say my point here. But I think that governments are in a way kind of like amoral, like they rationalize things for the interest even of their people that can then be like war, for example. Even what you believe is a just war, the people believe it because we're fighting what we think is bad, and dehumanization. And so all that to be thought of, look, if we're going to be very objective with what we're looking at and looking at what the U.S. government and Israel are doing in the UK, what they're doing in the world. I mean, just taking Israel and the U.S. and looking at the genocide, it's not hard to look at what Iran's government has also done in the world and it's just an objectively obvious reality that what the U.S. and Israel doing are way, way, way worse. I don't want to even go good, bad, or evil, but it's very clear to me that I would simply argue that if left to its own devices, any government would arguably grow to a point to where it is potentially capable of those things. But right now, to your point, yeah, of course we should ask that, even from the government perspective. Is it possible that they're not the evil boogeyman that they're making them out to be? Is it possible they're even the most, altruistic thing on the planet? Of course we should be able to consider that. And you're right to point out that there are people who are like incapable of that. And that does show you something. But to the point, though, I think it's important that we don't come at it as, that, like, not that you were saying that, but to those people speaking like that, it's important. I think we look at this as a very, we hold them to account for their actions, and we keep it at that, But yes, genocide is objective. And I think it's very clear that at least Iran is playing the counterbalance to that. As often, Vanessa and I had these conversations a long time ago about the idea of even Russia and the roles it was playing a long time ago, which I argued from my perspective, and I still say, were in many ways showing restraint, that we're standing by the side of what was the opposite of what the Western side was doing, which seemed to be the resistance to it. But you could argue that that was simply them being opportunistic, as I think that Myriam was suggesting, that more it's like where we recognize the opportunity of playing the counterbalance to such belligerent violence. Who's to say that they wanted that or cared about that, And it's just being objective, But I really value that point, to think about that we should be able to say maybe they're not what they appear to be or what we've always been told they are, very important.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Ryan. Thanks. And I think what is important, and that touches on both your point, Ryan, and Karim's point there, that when you talk about the kind of the discrediting of people that are effectively supporting the resistance in whichever country, like Syria, the number of analysts that would come out and say, I'm not an Assadist, but like you don't need to be an Assadist, for goodness sake. Like, why do you have to make that point? Because you're scared of the backlash. If you actually say, I support, if I would say I support the Syrian government because it's maintaining stability and it is battling a regime change war that has been actually ongoing for 75 years since Syria had its independence in 1946. There have been consistent MI6 CIA interferences and regime changes and black ops in Syria. It's never had peace from that. So as Ryan says, you have to be able to say that's the wrong, and regardless of what internal issues there may have been domestically in Syria or in any of these countries, Lebanon is a classic example. Nevertheless, you support the principle of ending colonialism and ending the colonialist project in the region. As Myriam said, what comes after, that's up to the people of the region, right? If you listen to Lindsey Graham, he's like, yeah, we want regime change in Iran. No one really cares what comes after, but we just want to get rid of the government that we don't like, as they did in 1953 with Operation Ajax to get rid of Mossadegh, because suddenly he'd nationalized the oil industry and so taken all of the resource interests away from the British and then later the Americans. That's the point they don't like. I have a problem with people thinking they can cast judgment on any other government anyway, because our focus as Westerners should be on what our government is doing. That's it. Stop. You can have an opinion, but a judgment is something else. You don't have a right to judge. Even living in Syria, I don't consider I had a right to judge what was going on domestically. My only role was to point out what my government and Western governments and Israel and Turkey, etc., were doing to this country and to this people, and that many of the problems that were actually impacting the people in Syria came from that operation to destabilize Syria and introduce sanctions and so on and so forth. And I think we shouldn't be afraid. I mean, if we look at Iran as a government, even if we look at Hezbollah as a movement, the fact that Iran was the first country in the world to introduce interest-free banking, how many people actually know that? In 1983, usury was banned. Of course, there are certain loopholes, there are certain criticisms within Iran itself, but the principle itself, find me one Western country that is even considering this kind of component in their domestic policy. It doesn't exist. Hezbollah has the same system here in Lebanon. Why is Israel bombing the Qad al-Hassan banking structure? Because the last thing the West wants is a country that is financially independent and is actually providing a system of lending that is usury-free, because that's an anathema to everything that the West and Israel and that entire Zionist system represents. I mean, if we look into the religious aspects, Jesus himself rejected that, right? So this is my point. We have to go beyond this sort of this fear of saying no. Like, there are aspects of whether it's a religious ideology, whether it is a political ideology. Syria was secular. I challenge any country in the Middle East to match Syria in its inclusion of every single sect and religion in that country. Huh?
Former Syria.
Former Syria.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But
I don't
Vanessa,
even think about the current Syria anyway.
The important question,
it's a
though,
cartoon
Vanessa,
country at the moment.
Yeah. The important question, though, is do you condemn Hamas? Right, like to go back to a Pierce Morgan moment, right? So
yeah.
that's the equivalent of what you would get on where you go through this very excellent breakdown.
Exactly.
You know, and it's just really,
yeah.
But to add to your point, the same kind of idea, you know, when this first started, and I think I'll speak from, I've learned a lot about a lot of these different things, and that I think I was very immersed in before this, but post October 7th, the more that I dove into these things even more, you know, my point was when this started, you know, it's obvious that whether or not you want to stand by the group and everything everyone's claimed they did, that you could stand up and say, I support the action of armed resistance that Hamas was carrying out. You know, and that's the kind of point, is that of course you should be able to say that, because it's internationally protected. It's a legal reality, but it doesn't mean you have, you know, and that's the idea, is that we have to be able to find those lines in there and not have, you know, unequivocally be like, I condemn this thing, you know, before I even start getting into the facts, because that's what they want from you. They want that capitulation to be able to enter that conversation. And it's a bar. That's the kind of game of the State Department expertise around all of these things that isn't even rooted in reality, you know?
I think there's a statement for Ghassan Kanafani years ago, decades ago actually, where he summarized this whole conversation very simply. He said they want you to have a conversation between the neck and the sword, right? Like they're willing to, you know, behead you, and then they want to have a conversation with you. And if you say no, you're beheaded. You know, if you say yes, then you're having a conversation between a neck and a sword. Like, that's not a conversation.
This is exactly what Trump is doing right now with his negotiations, right? He's basically saying, we're going to kill you unless you make a deal. And it's like, that's exactly that.
Yeah, precisely. And that's not a negotiation. That's a subjugation kind of thing. But to talk also a bit about the idea of good, bad, and whether a government is good or bad, I think most of the time, what people don't understand how we perceive things, because we are the ones who are experiencing, you know, the atrocities and the brutality. The way we perceive things is, what is the alternative? We don't ask if it's good or bad. That's a conversation we can have after we eliminate the options of alternatives that the West has given us. And really, in the past 20 years, they have been ISIS and Jolani, right? So it's not difficult to say, yeah, no. You know, it's really not difficult to say whatever we have, no matter what our issues with it is, we will fight to defend it. And for people who don't know, I will just give a brief kind of overview. In Syria, one of the most politically kind of the biggest opponent of the Ba'ath in Syria were the SSNP. They're the biggest opponents between Ba'ath and Syria's Assad, both Assads, by the way, Hafiz and Bashar, the biggest opponents were the SSNP, which is the Syrian Socialist Nationalist Party. Right? The moment a seeming civil war started in Syria, the first people to say, oh, no, that's it. We're going to fight with Assad. We're going to fight with the Ba'ath. We're going to fight for Syria. We're the SSNP. Right? And that just comes to show that these are people who are looking for nation building in the face of a project that's looking for fragmentation. Right? Similar things happened here in Lebanon. When the civil war started, there was no Hezbollah. As it went on, something called, the Amal movement kind of came along with Imam Musa Sadr, which was, surprise, surprise, supported by Mujahid called Mustafa Shamran. Mustafa Shamran is an Iranian that is a PhD doctor, I think, in the US. And he came back to Syria and Lebanon for the liberation of the region. And he became one of the ideology of the Islamic Revolution and Khomeini with the reality and structure and social fabric of Lebanon, the capabilities Syria has to support that in the face of an Israeli invasion. So do we see how many groups from different ideologies we're talking about here that are all coming together to face Israel? Because we understand where this is going. And Mustafa Shamran and the Amal movement also worked at the time with the Palestinians, with the SSNP that are in Lebanon, and with the secular leftist parties that were at the time active kind of armed resistance movements. They all work together. And if you come in and tell me, well, we have an issue with the Islamic thought, a lot of people have issues with a lot of things. A lot of Muslims have issues with a lot of aspects of the Islamic thought. This is something to debate. This isn't something to behead someone over. Right? The moment it becomes something to behead someone over, then you already stepped up above and beyond Islam. Right? You went towards something else. You went towards infiltration. You went towards kind of a version of Satanism that the Americans and the Brits will happily come in and say, we're happy to fund you, and make you a big, what governments we stand for, we stand against. Our people are just as much the same as anyone in the world. We have issues with our governments, we agree with them. We have issues with our parties, we agree with them, we disagree with them, we argue, we fight. We might even punch each other in parliament. But at the core of it, we understand who the enemy is, right? And and the truth is, when we don't, the conclusion is you have something like Lebanon, because Lebanon was never built to be a nation with a unified identity. It was built to attempt to be that, but ideally, the creation of it was for it to be an intelligence hub, right? And what happened is that people refused. Over time, that rejection became a capable resistance. Right? It didn't start as a capable resistance, but there was always resistance. It developed into a capable resistance. And now we have a division between those who say, no, not really. We don't want to ally with liberation movement. We will not allow to end up with. But if you look at the rest of the region, do you see that replicated? Do you see it in Iraq? It's equally understandable given the 2003 invasion. That's why it happened, so that it would result in that division. Otherwise, the Americans would have lost Iraq completely. So that idea that there is a good, bad government, there is something you should condemn first before you start the conversation, really just shows utter ignorance of the region and how it's built and what its social fabric is like and how its government functions and how, for example, what is an Islamic rule. Like most people don't even understand what an Islamic rule is in Iran. Today they had their the first funeral for the first Christian martyr in Iran. You know, it was public. It was outside. Everybody showed up. No one came and said, no, he's a kafir. Like this is an American version of what Islamists are like in some Hollywood movie. We are people of the book for the Muslims, and any martyr by Israeli and American fire is a martyr, worthy of honor and dignity and respect as much as any other martyr. So the whole concept is Eurocentric. The whole approach is inherently meant to drive the person they're interviewing into their pit of dirt before the conversation even starts. And so there isn't a conversation. There is a constant attempt to defend one's right to have a thought. That is it.
I'll add one thing to that I think is interesting is that, you know, I think it's disgusting to see where like it's a almost worse or a revival of the post 9/11 kind of like anti-Muslim sentiment in this country right now, being led by ridiculous people like Laura Loomer and Randy Fine, and being stoked very much by the highest levels of the Trump administration. And it's just disgusting, like just pure bigotry, irrational, right? But what I want to highlight though is that I think that it is, and I think it behooves us to think the same kind of way with the government, you know, all or nothing kind of view. I don't believe that most people in, like, let's just say the conservative movement are really adopting what the higher level centralized view is, you know, kind of framing them all as thinking. I think it's important on both sides of the left-right paradigm in this country or anywhere in the world, the false binary, that we think of that and realize that I think most people are starting to feel uncomfortably aware of all of this. Just worth noting that, you know, but I agree that it's just this backward view. Like, I'm so glad you made that point, by the way, and I'm going to make sure I make a point of that on my show about the way that was, you know, the Christian martyr in Iran. And for some people in this country who are on that line, who are watching people like Loomer, to look at that difference and to look at what you're doing, or like for people that are screaming about how dare they pray in public in a public place in the United States. It's like, have you lost yourself? Have you lost what it means to be an American, you know, or at least what we claimed it meant, you know? It's just so disgusting to see that. I just wanted to comment on that because it is a dangerous path right now, but I really see, or have hope at least, that that's not the majority of people in this country. And I'd like to think that'll guide us past this, you know?
Well, this
I would like to invite those.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I would like to invite those that have a problem with people praying outside. I'd like to invite them to Spain, maybe this Friday and maybe this Sunday. And I would like to see what their opinion about people praying in public spaces would be. That's just, you know, putting it out there.
Well, you mentioned Hollywood, Myriam, and that kind of Hollywood style propaganda. I write a lot about that in my articles. The psychological racist effect of that kind of narrative and that kind of propaganda, and it is so powerful and it is so deep rooted in the West that people are not just fearful and scared of anything Islam. Literally, the Arabic language is criminalized. Everybody is scared for an Arab word. It doesn't matter what you say, whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's jihad, it doesn't matter. It's all scary, it's all bad, and it's all evil. And people just don't. There's almost a psychological block to show sincere affinity with not just Muslims, but just people who are Arabs or West Asians in general. Persians, doesn't matter. You know, that's such a powerful propaganda system that has been there for decades.
Dehumanization. I mean, it's obviously a central role in everything the U.S. government or just West has done. You know, I mean, I'm always speaking from an American perspective as somebody, you know, reporting. I look at it this way. I can have the most effect in this country as being in this country, but it's even larger than just the West. But the idea of the dehumanization is such a gross tactic today that it's all over the world. You know, you try to create this rabid view. I mean, even in this last election, I thought it was called out pretty much on both sides, that it seemed both the left and the right in the United States were not even just leaning into, but stoking like the lowest common denominator of both sides. You know, and I think it speaks to the kind of the collapsing empire that we're living through, in my personal opinion. But I think it's just that's the idea, is you have to create this world where they are not just not, less than human. They're like the evil. They're the boogeyman in the closet. They justify these actions. It's every war in history, I think.
Yeah, I think I just
Absolutely.
also
I
wanted
would
to.
invite anyone who has an
Sorry.
issue.
Go on.
Go ahead. I was gonna say
No,
everyone who
because I
has an
want
issue with the Arabic language.
Yeah, carry on. She always interrupts me anyway, but it's
You
normal.
you're welcome to join a Maronite mass where we actually well it has some Syriac in it, but we definitely read the Bible in Arabic, and I think it might be a terrifying experience, to realize that the word Allah is God. It might be a terrifying experience, absolutely.
I often point out about intifada, where I call it the American Intifada. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, just understand that, you could call it whatever you want. It's the same idea. And you guys it's, that's an important point to flesh out for some people, though, because, or like the what is it? The Shahada flag versus an ISIS flag, or, like the misinterpretation of these things deliberately by dishonest people.
Yeah, definitely. I think, oh God, I've slightly forgotten what I was going to say now. I think one important thing because I was kind of looking into, Myriam knows this, the whole parliamentary system in Iran, the banking system. Yes, the introduction of CBDC, which is generally to push back against Western sanctions because it's linked up with the Russian system, is for people to also understand that these governments, and Syria included, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Myriam, but Assad, basically, for example, Bashar al-Assad, accepted the CIA black sites being established inside Syria as an attempt to get the sanctions taken off Syria. That's one aspect of it. That had been imposed for Syria supporting terrorism, which was effectively the PKK. Then America went on to weaponize against Assad. This is the sheer hypocrisy of the entire kind of colonialist campaign by the West. And then, of course, the country that is forced to actually accept measures or to work within a system from which there is no escape because they've been sanctioned, they've been besieged, they've been isolated, they've been blockaded, are then blamed for somehow buying into a Western system because there's nothing else left available to them. Right. That's a really important point for people to understand. It's like coming back to the Hamas and Israeli funding thing. Actually, just one aspect of this was the reaction by Israel to the Great March of Return, which I think was 2018, 2019, when effectively Gazans tried to peacefully protest the incarceration of Palestinians in what is effectively now a death camp, even then was a concentration camp, and even a peaceful march. They were being sniped, they were being shelled, they were being killed in their hundreds, if not thousands. But the pressure then was brought upon Israel to allow Qatari money, zakat, into Gaza. So, but that has been converted in. See, Israel is funding Hamas. There are other aspects to it, but it's so important to understand the measures that people living under occupation, living under siege, living under isolationism, what measures they're forced to take to try and alleviate the pressure on their people. That's an incredibly important aspect of this whole discussion. And what was really interesting for me, one of the aspects I was looking at, I suddenly thought, okay, I'm going to ask how many billionaires there are in Iran. Because when we look at the oligarchs, right, when we look at that kind of overarching transnational oligarchy, which is effectively trying to bring in this entire tyrannical system of AI, surveillance, digital, a central nervous system which can effectively eliminate you if you don't agree with the establishment. Exactly what we've seen in Gaza and in Hebron, one of the first 15-minute cities, but with very deadly consequences for Palestinians living in it. There are 0 billionaires in Iran. according to Forbes, according to any, of the kind of constructs that actually investigate billionaires globally and list them, there's zero. The only ones that exist were born outside Iran. So what does this actually tell you? It tells
Family
you,
of the Shah?
no, Pierre Omidyar, believe it or not, is one of them, right?
Yeah, I was
and
joking.
in 2025, the total wealth of 6 billionaires, so only 6 billionaires, and all of them born in the West, so that is a big message, was 24 billion, which is kind of pygmy billionaires compared to the rest of the world. Pierre Omidyar, I didn't know that, is Iranian origin, 12 billion. And then there's a couple of others, 117, but that's it. And that, for me, what does that tell me? It tells me that the West is the disease, right? And at the moment, whatever system is running in Iran, it's not creating that system of oligarchy and billionaire elitism. It isn't.
Or
And Hong
the
Kong is the
that
number
for me
one.
was
I actually posted just recently
Sorry.
I just recently posted a graph in one of my articles where Hong Kong, my hometown, is the number one in the proportionately in amount of billionaires per head of the population in the world. Okay, Hong Kong,
Wow.
which is of course part of socialist China. Eh? Let's not forget that. So it's very interesting when you think about that. Of course. So yeah, what can I say in that sense? In that sense, it is a very revolutionary society, of course, Iran. Let's not forget. I mean, it's one of the it's maybe the only country in the world, or one of the very few, where you don't have these hyper-rich capitalists.
And you have free healthcare, you have free education. Women, contrary to the propaganda that is rammed down our throat on an hourly basis, women are actually more empowered in Iran. I've been to Iran 3 times. And in 2022, after the Masa Amini riots, of course, enabled by Mossad, CIA, MI6, just as they were this year in January. Women are the most empowered. They're some of the strongest women I've ever met. The same I can say in Syria, and the same I can say here in Lebanon, for sure. They're scary. They're incredibly empowered, contrary to how they're perceived or how they're portrayed by Western media.
And compare that to the, Saudi Arabia, to the other allies that they sidle up next to. I did want to make one point about the CBDC point, but you want me to throw it to you first?
Yeah, sure.
Well, he's going to ask a question. Well, I'll go ahead and say it real quick then. Just the idea that, it's important you mentioned the CBDC point in Iran. And, I would argue that it's, I completely agree that very well may be the justification in their mind to push back against what they see as an obvious force that's trying to destroy them, trying to infiltrate them. Just like, any number of other things, controlling media, from one perspective, you say, well, I don't agree with that kind of control. But at the same time, what other choice do they have? I mean, it's clear that you can see that. However, I would argue just from a broad perspective of where I see all of this going, not to speak from, what they must be dealing with in all of this, that going in that direction, I still argue is the wrong choice. The CBDC direction, the digital ID, even in response, that very well could be a problem, reaction, solution kind of direction for the larger technocratic goal. I think all those things are worth considering in the bigger picture. I just want to include that, even though I agree with what they're fighting against.
I think because I actually thought about that. I think my only point would be, yes, that would be a worry if you had like a Javed Zarif government. No, I got that completely wrong, didn't I? Zarif government. For example, if you had a very Western-oriented, Western-focused government, but Zarif has been effectively sidelined for that reason. So I agree with you, the threat is there, but I think the threat is only there if the West succeeds in regime change and in destroying the structure of governance in Iran. Then that becomes a threat. Does that make sense?
Oh, definitely. I worry about the infiltration though, like the tech side of it, whether they
Yeah,
want that
yeah,
communication
of
or not, that
course.
they can be infiltrated because of the tech
Yeah.
that they add, that's what I worry about. But
Mm,
you make a good point.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and that brings me also to we're almost approaching the end. So that brings me to a final
Mm,
question I have actually for all of you, something that I have been struggling with for quite a while now. Sometimes I get accused by people, especially in the anti-imperialist spheres, of being too pessimistic. And you are, how do you say that? What is that word for it?
Black pilled.
That
doom.
no,
Black
not
pills.
doom, but that you feel defeatist,
Yes.
because I
Oh, okay.
highlight too much of the negative sides of things. And I agree. I admit if you read my articles, I'm a pessimistic writer. But I do love hope, and I do cling on to hope. I always say, if I was a defeatist person, I would stop writing about it and live my life. Why do I keep writing? Why do I feel that motivation? It's because I believe in a different world and a possibility for a different world. And my question, therefore, is this is something that makes me often a little bit fearful. We have seen so many disappointments. Okay, I remember the moment that Assad fell, and I remember that Syria was, yeah, you could say completely destroyed, and that was a uniquely painful moment, I must say, because it really created in me, inside of me, a sense of hopelessness, almost like empire just bloody wins again. It was so, like it had a very powerful psychological effect. What we see right now is something I think many of us did not expect. You see the Iran responding in a way against empire that is nobody expected that. You see Hezbollah suddenly rising again and fighting like never before. Uh, in other words, I actually start to feel a sense of optimism, and that makes me very scared because I'm so afraid of having that experiencing that disappointment again. And of course, that sounds very egotistic. It's more that I just don't want to see people over there suffer, and this genocide is so terrible. What we're experiencing right now, and it can get worse. So my question is, how optimistic are you guys? Do you see do you see a way out? Do you feel optimism about the moment that we are in? That is my first question from all of your own unique perspective. And to what extent do you think the stories about the United States and Israel going nuclear are realistic? And
If
maybe
I
I
could
can
go
start.
first. Well,
Yeah,
sorry,
sure,
I
sure.
have to jump off in a couple minutes for
Okay,
the next
sure.
show. So I'll just finish up and thank you guys I really enjoyed this. I'd love to connect with you, Myriam, personally, by the way, just to get deeper into the Lebanon point of this. But I think that I'm sorry. What was the first part? I ended up with the second part. I forgot the first
Oh,
question.
the
Was
first part is
hopeful.
what to do with that optimism that I'm also like slightly dare to feel. And
Mhm.
then the second part is, to what extent do you think the nuclear option is actually a viable option for the US
Right.
empire?
Well, I actually, and I think this is something that I get a lot of pushback for, but I feel very hopeful right now with where we are in the world, as much as that may feel counterintuitive, because it's really more so than anything because of the awareness around a lot of these conversations. Post October 7th, whatever you want to talk about, I personally feel a large part of it was because of the way they handled that. They basically shot themselves in both feet, shifted the conversation, and people are aware of what that is to a degree that I never would have expected or predicted.
Mm,
I'm blown away by the amount of people that are calling whether it's about Zionism, the long-term agenda, greater Israel, maybe I'm in more of a bubble than I realize. But I think, I can ask people on the street and it seems they know things I never would have expected. So I'm feeling very hopeful that that's possible, that we have an opening there, that should we truly put some effort into, that we could see a change. Now, who's to say that's going to go in a direction I want it to, but change is what I think change at the very least, because of how bad the situation we're in seems stagnant. It seems insurmountable half the time. And I'd like to see something shift. And so I am feeling hopeful about the awareness around that. And I feel like it's worth fighting for. And I do think there's a lot of bad things happening in the world, but I see a lot of empowered I guess resistance with the conversation today, like spreading up all over the place from within like the two-party illusion, as much as I don't even want to compare that to kind of resistance we're talking about. I see people that are starting to stand up and ask things and call things out from in like hardcore blind partisan positions from like last year. I feel hopeful about that. But on the side of the nuke side of it, I feel I'm of the mind that I'm worried about where Israel pushes this. Outside of that, I don't think that's likely, because I feel like most everybody else in the conversation is acting from largely opportunistic, profiteering perspective, control, influence. And then I think there's a dangerous overlap of that religious Zionism influence in this administration. But I would say from every other perspective that it's not about, all a Samson option. I think it's about control and influence. So I would argue that if it's about where Israel drives this, and I think that the danger is if they continue to lose the way that I see it going, that very well may be the case. And I'm not a hyperbolic sort of fear mongering kind of reporter, but I do think that's possible. And I think it's worth considering that. But I think honestly, my opinion is that the better path will win out, to put it that way. But thank you all for having me on, and I really did enjoy this, guys. I have to break off, so thanks again, and I'll see y'all next time.
Thanks, Ryan. It was
Take
great.
care.
Pleasure.
Myriam?
Oh, wow. So first of all, to be honest, this is a path that was paid for in blood. And I know for most people, they haven't seen it coming. But this is exactly what we've seen coming for the past 50 years. 47, actually, to be fair. For the past 47 years, this is exactly what everyone has been working towards. The battles in between, some of them are won, some of them are lost. Some of them will appear to be a major strategic defeat, but will turn out over time to be an opportunity disguised. There is no way that we fail at this, because if we do, then none of us will remain around to figure that out. So that would be the positive side of it, to put it that way. We are to a large degree in the region, the resistance movements, the people that back the resistance movements. There is a clear positioning of people willing to fight for this to the death. And with our leaders literally at the forefront of the lines of martyrdom. In 2020, if I'm not mistaken, Syed Hassan spoke particularly about what's happening right now, about the mistake it would be if the US decided to go to war with Iran, about the mistake it would be if the Gulf allowed the US to use their territory to go to war with Iran. And the conclusion that he came up with at the time is now truly unfolding before our eyes. So there is one way this ends, and it's our way. Now the price we pay for it, that's a whole different conversation. And I think I'm just going to repeat what we've been saying since Operation Al-Aqsa Flood was launched from Gaza, which is the push for the battles that I call the mother of all battles. We might not all survive, but we will not abandon this path. And so whatever the cost will be, the cost of failure now is going to be much heavier than the cost of resistance. So will the Americans use nuclear weapons? They might use something of a tactical nature, in my opinion. I don't know. I don't think they would go full on nuclear for three main reasons. Primarily, I don't know if the Iranians will let them have anything to go nuclear with, because they're practically targeting most of the positions and the capabilities that would allow for something of the sort to happen. So it depends between now and the time that such a decision would be made. What would be left? What would the options be? And second, it's because there's an understanding in historic wars that where one war ends, this is where the next war starts. So are the Americans willing to take in a nuke once the Russian or the Chinese or anyone who allows nuke, because Iran doesn't, from a faith position, from a humanistic position, from a better world position, they don't allow the use of nuclear weapons. Until now, this fatwa has not been reversed. And so, are the Americans willing to take for the first hit at them to be a nuke? That would be insane. But that would become an option the moment the Americans use a nuke against Iran. However, I do think they would use mass destruction, weapons of mass destruction. The entire cities, maybe the way people imagine, like dropping a nuke on Tehran or something. So I hope that answers the question, but yeah.
Yeah, that does. Vanessa?
Yeah, I mean, very similar, obviously. You know, I'm living here. I was living in Syria. The fall of Syria was a huge trauma following on from the assassination of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, of course. It was deeply traumatizing for everyone. And of course, it's also, no one has the time to properly grieve in these wars because they're endless. As one ends, as Myriam said, another one starts. But having been privileged enough to be out on the ground and be able to go to some of the real resistance strongholds here in Lebanon, just, you know, for a few visits, the feeling of optimism, despite the huge losses, despite the bloodshed, despite the destruction. I remember being in Syria, and I think I told Myriam this story, and I was in Aleppo, and there was a Syrian army soldier came in. He'd been fighting ISIS. They had regained ground from ISIS. He was really wired. And he told me, he said, you know, I love my president, meaning Bashar al-Assad. But if this were Hafez al-Assad, he would destroy all of Syria to end this war and rebuild it. That's the mentality of resistance, to not be afraid of the loss if the victory is as great as it promises to be. From afar, we look at it and we see the bombs. You know, my family are constantly messaging me, are you okay? Yeah, like, you know, it's fine. It happened a long way away from where I am. But from outside, or even when I speak to friends in Syria, they're not feeling optimistic because they're living under Jolani. They're living under total lack of law, lack of system, where rape, theft, violence, assassination, killings can happen anywhere at any time. They're living in a horrible, horrible system right now. And for them, it's very hard to feel optimistic. But I can tell you, as soon as the gains increase from the resistance axis, so from Iraq, from Yemen, from Iran, from Lebanon, from Palestine, you're going to see a huge change in Syria. Something big is going to happen in Syria. And if you ask me if I'm optimistic, I hope we all have Christmas in Damascus this year.
Well said. Well said. And on that optimistic note, let's end it here. So I finally have a feel good after a show with Vanessa.
Oh, don't say it like that.
No, I'm
You
kidding.
should
I'm
always
kidding.
invite me.
But
You should
you and
always
I,
invite me, I'm telling you.
yeah. Yeah, no, because and I'm guilty of it as well. But we usually talk about such horrible things that the end of the show is usually not very optimistic. But at least that's an optimistic note. So I'd love to end on that here. Myriam, also thank you for coming, and we're definitely gonna do this again. This was a great panel. I think we can definitely do that again soon. And because this is not enough time, but unfortunately I also have to go.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's talk next time. And good luck to you both. Stay strong and keep fighting the good fight.
Thank you, Kareem. Thanks for having us on.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Have a
Bye.
good one.
Bye.
Bye.
Static crackles, voices rise, Truth breaks through their velvet lies, a screen of fire, a shield of steel. BettBeat Myriam makes you feel no borders, no change, no silence.